Thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising this meeting. I know a great deal of thought has gone into it, and I'm very privileged to be able to say a few words at the beginning, particularly following the very powerful motivation that we have to try to make a difference. I'm going to talk about EURAMOS 1. This is the name of a clinical trial, but the important thing for today is that it represents an example of a collaboration about focused on osteosarcoma. I think it was a landmark collaboration, and I'm not going to go through all the results of the trial, but simply to try to draw some points out that may be helpful from, for thinking about the rest of the information today. I'm also going to talk, because we're in the UK and this is about UK, I'll talk about this in the perspective of the UK. So just to begin with, EURAMOS 1, as I said, was a clinical trial. There has been a very strong tradition of conducting clinical trials in osteosarcoma in the UK, beginning back with a publication that came out in 1986, but treated patients between 1975 and 1981. This was a randomized study of chemotherapy. It showed survival results that weren't very dissimilar from those that were achieved without chemo or reported without chemotherapy. But then importantly, a series of randomized studies were undertaken through an organization called the European Osteosarcoma Intergroup, which was only a little bit of Europe because mostly it was Denmark, the Netherlands and Belgium. But I think the investigators that were involved in that set a precedent for undertaking collaborative clinical trials. The difficulty was that first, these trials didn't identify clearly better treatments, and second, they took some time to undertake, even with the cooperation of those several countries. So if we move on to around the beginning of this century, a number of things happened, which is that some data emerged from a clinical trial that randomized about just over 600 patients to a new treatment for osteosarcoma, and it produced a range of curves which were difficult to understand and interpret. What they didn't do is give a clear indication of a new standard of care or something that was clearly better than was being achieved with standard treatments to that point. This was a trial undertaken by the largest group, if you like, which was a group in America, the Children's Oncology Group, and it prompted a sort of a bringing together of investigators to recognize a single problem was that we weren't making much progress. And out of that was also the observation that to undertake larger trials, because the difficulty with this trial is that even with 600 patients, it didn't give us a clear answer. If we wanted to do, say, a larger trial with perhaps 2,000 patients, then for the French, at their previous rate of accrual, it may take 60 years, and even for America, it might take 12 years. And there was a general agreement that this was too slow. So out of this was born a collaboration, the European and American Osteosarcoma Study Group. It settled down with 4 study groups, the German group, and it's great that Stefan is here and we'll talk to you in a moment. The US Children's Oncology Group, the EOI that I've mentioned, and the Scandinavian group. And with very clear aims and objectives to improve survival from osteosarcoma and to carry out large international randomized trials as the key way of trying to do that. So EURAMOS is characterized by flags, and there were a number of countries involved. And they ran a simple study addressing a relatively straightforward question, which was if one, could one, by changing the treatment given after surgery, improve survival. And the net result of this was that there was over 2,000 patients included in this study, and randomizing nearly 700 in one randomization and nearly 600 patients in another randomization. So in many ways, a step change from the previous clinical trials that have been undertaken, both in the degree of collaboration and the speed, because this was undertaken fairly quickly. For the first UK patient was entered into the study in 2005, and the last patient was in the study in 2011. So we had achieved at least one goal, which was doing clinical trials more rapidly. But it takes a lot to do that, and I'm grateful for Matt Sides at the MRC Clinical Trial Unit for drawing all these arrows and showing the complex interrelationship that needed to take place for an academic-led clinical trial across multiple countries in a rare cancer at a time when regulation around clinical trials was changing very rapidly. This was coordinated through London, but it required pharmacovigilance to be carried out in Germany and a quality of life centre also in Germany. But most of all, very close cooperation between trials units, investigators, a great many people across all these countries. So was it helpful? Well, we on average randomized over 200 patients each year. And so this compares with what had been achieved in the previous European osteosarcoma intergroup studies, which had only managed about just over 50 patients a year. And so again, just to make that point, if we'd wanted to do this on our own, it would have taken about 40 years. So I certainly used to say, perhaps I was the only one, but saying that EURAMOS 1 was really just a test for EURAMOS 2. It was about building that platform by which we'd be able to start investigating new treatments, things that really may take us much further forward, both in the duration and quality of survival for people with osteosarcoma. And certainly we did create a collaborative model, and that drove a lot of discussions about how one could do this and what were the routes to success in rare cancers. And we began to discuss future trials as early as 2009, so before the last patients had been recruited into EURAMOS 1. However, there has been no EURAMOS 2. There have been a number of protocols written, but we have not conducted a further randomized study on this scale. There's a number of reasons for that. There's all sorts of challenges that one encounters when we get people to talk to each other about something that they're all involved in. It'll be interesting to see how we get on today. But when you do that across 14 countries, then it becomes more complex. So a number of different aspects have to be taken into account before one gets to the real difficulties of regulation and of money. Okay. But of course, missing from this is also about the clinical questions. What is it that we should be testing? And I think the principal driver that has been missing for producing another EURAMOS-like study is probably the testable question for which there was sufficient agreement that it was a priority. So I've drawn this out here. You can have a functioning collaboration, but you need a whole lot of other things that need to come together if you're going to create further trials. And I do think trials are important because they really do help us to define what is better treatment so we can advise patients with confidence and evidence. And there's been a very interesting example of this in the world of soft tissue sarcoma, where a new drug was introduced on the basis of a very small trial with quite difficult data to interpret. Many, many patients have then gone on to receive that drug while waiting the results of the confirmatory study, which has then been negative. And I think there's many lessons that we need to take from other examples that should help us inform how we improve studies for osteosarcoma. So I think EURAMOS 1 did show that one can undertake large trials. They're really hard, but not impossible. And I think that certainly we felt that the momentum that had built around the trial had spread far beyond the participating groups, so that a subsequent study, I think, would have been involved even more. we really needed, and didn't at that time, the voice of patients to be heard loud and clear through all the plans and operation of that study, and I would expect to see that in any future studies. And most importantly, if we'd carried on doing trials, then we would have recruited at least a minimum of 2,500 patients to a further trial since the study closed. So that feels like a missed opportunity. But then questions that we'll need to come to today is, although there are challenges, do we still need trials like this? And I'm not going to try to answer that now, but I think it's a pertinent question. And particularly it links to how we used the signal, or why haven't we got new drugs that are making the sorts of improvements that patients and families with osteosarcoma would like to see. So I'll simply finish by thanking everybody who was involved in the EURAMOS 1 trial, especially the 326 trial sites, lots of funding bodies, but most of all, it's the clinical colleagues that I think did something really quite unique here, coming together to work together on this enterprise. Thank you very much.